Okay, guys, let's get started with the lecture today. First of all, I hope that you had a nice break. Yeah, a nice reading break, 2 weeks catching up on things. I actually, to be honest, I really enjoy the second term over the first term because there we actually have a break in between. Yeah? Because let's face it, this is intense for all of us, for you as well. So I hope you had a nice break. Well, we had the assignment as well. So I received the assignment from most of you guys. I will not talk about the assignment right now. I will talk about the assignment probably in 2 weeks' time. The simple reason for that is for university policy things, I have to provide the opportunity for a late submission. So if you haven't submitted the assignment yet, you have an opportunity for a late submission. You will get a grade penalty on this, so you'll get a worse grade. But it's still open until the end of this week. If you have already submitted the assignment, forget about it. You're in the system. Or if you emailed me otherwise, forget about this as well. Yeah. Okay. So and then I'm going to have a look at it. I didn't have a look at it yet, but then we're going to talk about it probably in a lecture in 2 weeks' time. So I'll revisit the assignment. Okay. I hope you had fun with Roland the last time. Roland, he's my PhD student, and everything that he said in the lecture is relevant for the exam. It's a similar thing. He would have said exactly the same thing that I would have said. So in that sense, nevertheless, I'm going to catch up on a few of the things. So this is basically the things that I brought with me for this week. So we will talk about segregation. Yeah? So we will follow up on the big thought that Roland introduced, which is more like giving you this idea, like, hang on a moment, how much segregated, actually, how things actually are split up, how polarized things are. And that's a very general macro-level phenomena that we often do not really observe, right? Because we have this view of our environment, and we think everybody around us is like this. And because of that, we don't see whole parts of the society. And that becomes especially relevant, when you think about stuff like polarization in the US, political polarization in the US. It's a dream because it's huge. Yeah, it's huge. Yeah, and they're just really separated. Where you wonder how can that be? Where one part of the society cannot understand the other part of the society, and vice versa. So that's sort of like one example of sorting, and we will talk this week more about these kind of sorting processes, in particular about segregation, and we will also get towards how can it be? How can we end up with something like that? Yeah, and hopefully today I'm most likely only going to talk about the first 3 of these things, and about the other 3 I'm going to talk about on Friday. But the point of today is that you understand that and hopefully now you see how the different lectures here come together. Hopefully that you see how what we observe at the macro level, like this segregation, like the separation of people into different parts, how we need to be careful about drawing conclusions about the individuals from that. That's, to the assignment, without talking about it too much here, that would be an ecological fallacy if you draw too quickly from the macro level to the individuals. If you say, okay, there's segregation, everybody is a racist, that would be a fallacy to do that. Yeah? And that can have huge implications. So today we're going to talk about that. So that's sort of the point that I want to hammer home. But let's rewind a little bit and talk about segregation. Segregation, it's hard for us to believe, but not too long ago it was actually really a big issue in the States. This is a picture taken in the 1960s and the 1970s. Yeah? Where black people had to use different bathrooms or different toilets, where the bus, certain parts, the blacks had to sit and whites were sitting on others. And you could imagine, wow, this is second half of the 20th century United States. Yeah? And nowadays it's obvious, and then we had, of course, the Civil Rights Movement, and Roland would have talked about that a little bit, the Fair Housing Act and things like that. So nowadays it's actually less obvious, but when you look at the social differentiations, segregation is still huge. Racial segregation is huge. One example, just look in prison. Yeah? Look at the people who are in prison and look at the distribution of the population in general. or look at disadvantages in education, yeah? Look at income disparities. So segregation is huge, and that's sort of like, for us now as sociologists, the puzzling thing. Hang on, we did a lot of things to reduce it, but it's still there. How can that be? And that's basically where today's lecture comes in, because today's lecture suggests that there might be a segregation process, which is sort of not necessarily just about individuals. Okay, so segregation, a definition that Roland was introducing last time, but I'm going to repeat it here now, is segregation. We can think of it as the separation of individuals into distinct parts of social life. Well, it's a very general definition, but I hope that you understood what it means. It's really like, let's say some people, live in some parts of the neighborhood, while people with another attribute live in other parts of the city, in another neighborhood, and so on. And then you can think about this along all sorts of contexts or foci, and you can think about this in the context of housing, schools, or workplaces, like residential segregation. That's sort of like a classic in this area. And here it basically means, let's say, let's look at income now. Let's say poor people live in certain parts of Dublin, while rich people live in other parts of Dublin. So actually, I'm at the moment house hunting in Dublin, or actually apartment hunting. So I'm checking out the market a little bit and checking out all those neighborhoods, and it's totally the case. Yeah? So there are some neighborhoods where a certain kind of people live, while in other neighborhoods other kinds of people live. So it's not really mixed up. There is some separation here. And I haven't done any studies about this yet. It's just, my first-hand experience about it. Probably there's segregation according to social class, social status, and education. Yeah. And probably this is related to income or salaries. Some areas of town, cannot be afforded by some people, and so on and so forth. Yeah. But that would be residential segregation. So cities or countries or neighborhoods where individuals cluster, and other cities, countries, neighborhoods where other individuals cluster. That's the idea, separation. And that's just something that we observe. Yeah? So that's something that we study. Is there residential segregation out there? And there is. And then the next question is, why is it there? Yeah? And what can we do about it? But it doesn't have to be limited to neighborhoods or to housing. Yeah? Actually, we do observe school segregation a great deal. Again, in the US, it was the classic case where blacks would go to one school and whites would go to another school. And even when let's say, white people lived in a black neighborhood, they bused their kids to another school, to go to another school, not to go to the school where the other black people went. And nowadays we have that. I was involved in some studies where we looked at that in Sweden. And you would think, oh God, Sweden, that's such a liberal country. They don't have that. Well, actually, they do have segregation. They do have school segregation to quite a degree. There it's not blacks and whites, it's about ethnic minorities. So ethnic minorities go to certain schools, and the native Swedes, they send their kids to other schools. And then, I don't know how it works in Ireland right now. I'm not involved in this. Well, obviously I don't have any kids, but I don't know if people are forced to go to a certain school in Ireland. Sometimes, depending on where you live, you have to go to a certain school. And oftentimes there are these discussions, okay, let's lift that. Yeah? And they did that in Sweden not too long ago, a few years back. And what happened is that segregation dramatically increased. Basically, then the Swedes chose to drive their kids around and to not have them go to the schools where the ethnic minorities would go to. Basically where foreigners would go to. So we still have segregation along schools, even nowadays. Yeah? We don't even have to go back to the US of the 1960s or 70s. And surely in Ireland we have that pretty much as well. Well, actually, from some colleagues, a colleague of mine, Matt. Oops, maybe you know Matt. Matt, he has a little son, and he told me about registering for schools and so on. So I was shocked to hear that in Ireland you need to have the proper religion to be accepted to a certain kindergarten or to a certain school or things like that. So sometimes it's even institutional. Okay, but it's not just residences or schools. It can also be along workplaces. And that's sort of like, these are sort of like the three big areas where people study segregation nowadays, or certain kind of researchers that look at social inequalities and social stratification and so on. Workplace segregation means that certain kinds of jobs or occupations, occupational segregation is another aspect that we have, that, I don't know, classic is that women have certain kinds of jobs and men have other kinds of jobs. That's segregation here, according to jobs. But on the top of that, it's on certain workplaces as well. You know, for example, let's say when certain companies are overwhelmingly run by men, they hire more men. Yeah? Or when some places there are more, I don't know, ethnic minorities, then as an ethnic minority member, you have more chances to get a job there. So we have segregation along workplaces as well. So you see like a whole bunch of contexts where segregation can actually happen. And once you kind of open your eyes a little bit, you see it quite a lot. Actually, the area where you might see it most, and that's sort of my field of research, I study social networks. So when I'm not teaching here, I research on social networks, these kind of things. This is like a friendship network of an American high school. Don't ask me what the colors now mean. I think it must be gender segregation, yeah. And there, what happens is that most often your friends have similar attributes than you. Your friends are often very similar. Starts with the age categories. Yeah, how many people are your good friends who are 70 years old? Not that many, probably. Or how many of your best friends just got into kindergarten? Yeah. So, but that's just one dimension, age. Yeah? But actually it happens along education. Most of the people in your friendship circles have a similar education to you. How can that be? Well, it's actually pretty straightforward. You're all at university, you get to know each other, you become friends, you have something in common. So you see, this is actually here now a selection effect happening, that I don't know, people choose to go to university, they get a similar education, and because they are at university, they get to know each other and become friends, right? So that's one mechanism that leads to that, but there are other ones as well. Social influence, for example. So we know that too, that people get influenced by the people around them, and then they become more similar. But in either way, we observe a lot of segregation. Actually, I just finished a paper over the break with not with Roland, but with Travis, my second PhD student. And we looked at these kind of networks for, in 800 schools all over Europe. And we looked at people's friendship networks, like graphs like this, and we investigated to which degree people are friends with other people who have a similar body mass index as themselves. It's about health, it's about, I don't know, social networks and health outcomes. And there we found that there's a huge association. So let's say if you happen to be overweight, you're more likely to have friends who are overweight. While on the other side, if you happen to be underweight, you're also more likely to have friends who are underweight. And then when we think about health implications, you know, certain things get reinforced through networks. So networks actually are crucially important for health outcomes. And we just detected segregation, or in this case we called it social clustering. It's just another word for this thing here, in high school networks. So we observe segregation a lot. Yeah, and if you ask me about the one finding that social network analysis is most pronounced about, or I don't know, that has been most persistent over the last 30, 40 years, it's this. Yeah? It's social clustering, or we call it homophily or homogeneity. Essentially, these are different words for the same thing, that your friends tend to be similar than you. And this has all sorts of consequences then afterwards. Yeah? But that's a whole other battle. So segregation can happen along many different contexts. You know? So I outlined 3 or 4 of them, but you know, there are even more. There can be sorting in marriages. Actually, it's a huge research field. It's called, I don't know, assortative mating or assortative matching. Oftentimes when people marry, they marry others who have a similar education to themselves, or who are similar in many other ways. You find it across occupations, peer groups, actually even in lunchrooms. Monja actually did a study on this, like who sits next to whom in the lunchroom. And it turns out to be that similar people sit next to each other, dormitories, prisons, church congregations, wherever. Right? So it's actually huge. But then we can also have it along different kinds of dimensions. Yeah? We talked about, I don't know, racial segregation. That's the one that is most pronounced, but it can be along age. I don't know, that your friends are most likely to have similar age than you, can be along sex, yeah, especially in primary schools. It's very segregated. Boys are almost always only friends with other boys, and girls are almost always only friends with other girls. Changes then later on in teenage years, but still, not just along race, but also along ethnic categories. No, I brought up the example of Sweden, so there we have that too. And actually, yeah, it's another paper that I've been working on over the last 2 weeks, where we look at how people move around in Stockholm. So we have this amazing data set about where people live in Stockholm over the last 20 years. So we can really track down every single person that lives in Stockholm, and we look at how do native Swedes move, how do they leave a neighborhood and go to another one, and how do foreigners leave a neighborhood and where do they move to. Yeah? Basically, we can look at the flows of how people move around in the city in terms of where they live. Yeah? And ultimately, we are interested in what is it that is driving ethnic segregation in Sweden. Why is it that you find segregated neighborhoods? Because it could be, and that's sort of like the setup, this is how you write papers. I don't know, you have a hypothesis or you have competing hypotheses and you put them against each other. In this paper, we're saying there could be, actually in the literature says there could be two main reasons for this. This could be that native Swedes that move out of a certain neighborhood, they avoid moving into other neighborhoods where lots of foreigners live. Yeah? That would be avoidance behavior. Or it could be that native Swedes are more likely to move out of neighborhoods where already many foreigners live. That would be ethnic flight behavior. Yeah? So you're leaving or you're going somewhere, right? Maybe they just leave whenever they want to leave because they just, they don't care about who else is living in the neighborhood. So in this paper, we're kind of trying to separate these things out. But you see, this is actually a lot of ongoing research in this field. Consequences of segregation. I guess Roland talked about these kind of things. So I'm not going to talk too much about it. So we want to understand this. Yeah, we want to understand how can it be that there is segregation. Now let me walk that through in the context of residential segregation, also because it's the most prevalent one and the one where this literature comes from. So let me talk about residential segregation a little bit. It's just still catching up on the last lecture before the break. Actually it has proven to be extremely resistant to change. And here I show you, this is now a map of New York. Maybe you remember it or maybe you see it. And so you see, I don't know, I think this is Manhattan down here somewhere. I think this is Manhattan here. This is Brooklyn. Yeah? And the colors now represent individuals of different ethnic groups. Basically, these are census tracts, small little groups, and it kind of shows you like where. So one dot stands for 1,000 people. A lot of dots in there, so there's a lot of data in here, and basically tells you the color of the dot tells you the most people of a certain ethnic group, where they live. Yeah? And when you look at that, when you look at this picture, it looks like, hang on a moment, I don't know, here down in Brooklyn. Almost always blacks live. Yeah? Further down here, and then the cool areas of Brooklyn, white people live. Manhattan, lower part, white people live. If you go a little further up, it's almost only Hispanics, right? So when you look at this, you see, hang on, there's a huge amount of segregation happening here. Yeah? And we can, let me quickly see if this is going to work, because we can look at this in other countries as well. It's not that this is sort of like a unique thing for New York. So this is a cool website, by the way, anyway. Yeah? So let me see. I think what I wanted to show you was Chicago. Where is Chicago? Okay, so this is Chicago now. Yeah, see the Great Lake. Let me zoom out. Can I see? Okay. So there's Chicago, in the States. Let's zoom in. Similar picture, yeah? There's sort of like whole neighborhoods where, I don't know, they seem to be black dominated. Other neighborhoods that seem to be Hispanic dominated. Other neighborhoods that seem to be white dominated. These are sort of like the ethnic categories according to the US Census here. So there seems to be a lot of segregation going on. This is 2015. So what could we think based on that? Well, that's a little exercise that I have for you guys now. So I want you to discuss with your neighbor for 2 minutes possible explanations for the puzzle why we still observe so much residential segregation with respect to ethnicity in the 21st century. So this is New York, seemingly liberal, cosmopolitan cities, but we have ethnic segregation. So take 2 minutes and then we're going to talk about this. Okay, basically the point why I wanted you to think about this a little bit is because the most straightforward explanation here is that people are intolerant Yeah? It could be. We think we live in a tolerant world, but maybe people are less tolerant than we think they are. And that actually would be a common sense explanation here. But then, some people had some additional ideas. And that's exactly the kind of stuff that I want you to get to. Maybe nowadays people are tolerant, but maybe there's something that reproduces those inequalities that have been there in the first instance. Yeah? So one point that was brought up was that, okay, maybe there was segregation in the past. I don't know. But nowadays, people had kids. Those kids are much more tolerant, but they still happen to live close by where their parents lived. What happens then? Then you still have segregation, even though nowadays nobody might be intolerant anymore. And so that could be one of those things, how segregation can survive at the macro level, even though in the individual level there might be no discrimination happening anymore. Yeah? And that's actually a big puzzle. Yeah? And we'll come back to that puzzle in a second. But then there could be lots of other, actors here at play. Yeah? There are buyers, there are sellers, there are renters, there are landlords, there are politicians, all sorts of people that could factor things in here. But even if we kind of, for a moment, exclude them from what we are thinking about, and we just focus on this, what I just said earlier about individuals, preferences and individuals' maybe likes or dislikes to be in a certain neighborhood. A common sense theory would be there's segregation because people don't like each other. And you see, this would be like the ecological fallacy, actually. This would be like making an ecological fallacy, drawing from a macro level phenomenon that we observe to individual level behaviors. Yeah? That would be wrong. I'm going to show you now that empirically this does not hold. There is, if you could think, okay, this is the simplest explanation for it, but I'm going to show you that empirically we find no evidence for this. And so that's basically what I'm doing now. So maybe you remember my lecture from last year or earlier this year, I talked about explanations a little bit as well, and the way we make an explanation. We think about something, and then we think a possible explanation, and then we think, okay, if that would be true, what else would have to be true? Yeah? Look at something else, excess explanatory power. Yeah? That's, John Elster. Or what else would not be true if that would be the case? So we can apply this here. So let's play that through. Yeah? Let's walk through that. If there is segregation because people don't like each other, what else would have to be true? Well, if that would be true, then high tolerance regions or cities would have lower segregation than low tolerance regions or cities. If I go out and I measure how tolerant people are, in the cities where I find less segregation, people should be more tolerant than in cities where I find more segregation. That makes lots of sense. A second implication would be that if that would be true, an increase in approval of integration should lead to decreases in residential segregation. So here we're going to look at how things evolve over time. Basically, we're going to compare data about segregation over time with data about how much people approve to integration, so how tolerant are people. And they should be linked with each other, if it is what the common sense theory suggests here, that people don't, there's segregation because people don't like each other. Yeah? This would be like two straightforward implications. And both of them we can actually test. We can actually look at, is that actually the case? So now I'm going to show you some data. This is now data from the United States, and there's a whole bunch of information in there. Let me walk you through it. First of all, you see on the y-axis the year, so it starts with 1940 and then it goes until the end of the 1960s. And then you have like separate columns for the north and the south of the United States. And then for each one of them, we have two columns, one for residential segregation and the other one for approval to residential integration. Let's talk about the approval to residential integration anyway. That's just a simple question where people were asked, do you approve to living in integrated neighborhoods? Yeah? And this number is high when people are tolerant. Let's say they approve integration. When this number is low, it tells you that people are intolerant. Okay, let's talk about the other column, the residential segregation column. That's basically a number that ranges from 0 to 100. Well, there are different indicators or different indices for how you measure segregation. Yeah? There's a whole literature on this. There's the dissimilarity index, or I don't know, or some other diversity measures and so on. Basically, this is a number that ranges from 0, meaning no segregation at all, to 100, meaning lots of segregation. So essentially, this kind of tells us how many percent of the blacks would have to be relocated in order to achieve a completely mixed neighborhood. Yeah? You have such different neighborhoods, and you have different blocks where people live, and then you would think, okay, how many would I have to move from one block to another block so that ultimately at the end, all blocks are completely mixed? That's basically what this number says. Yeah? And this number is high. That means you would have to move a lot of people to achieve this complete mixing. That means when the number is high, there's lots of segregation. While when this number is low, it means you don't have to move lots of people to achieve this complete mixing. That means there's low segregation to begin with. Yeah? Okay, so that's the data. That's the data. So now let's revisit these implications that we had from our common sense theory. So remember, the idea was there's segregation because people don't like each other, which is a reasonable assumption. Yeah? That's sort of where we as a researcher come into play, and then we go and we try to disprove it. Yeah? We go and we try to reject hypotheses like this. This is sort of how we incrementally improve our knowledge. If that would be true, high tolerance regions or cities should have lower segregation than lower tolerance regions or cities. Okay, let's check this out, how this actually works out. So now we actually have two regions here in the data set. That's sort of why we have this split between south and north. Yeah? When we compare these two columns, what do you observe? Actually, it's very straightforward. You see that the approval rating for integration is much higher in the northern states of the United States. And it's actually funny. It's almost 100 years after the Civil War, but it's still that kind of the South seems to be much more intolerant than the North. Or that was in the 1960s. Yeah? So hopefully nowadays it looks different. But that's sort of how it was in the 1960s. So basically from these numbers you can tell, do you understand, do you see that? That kind of the South is less tolerant than the North. Yeah? So in the, let's say in 1942, only 12% of the people in the South are in favor of approved integrated neighborhoods, while in contrast 42% of the people in the North favor or approve residential integration. So that's what we find. People in the north of the US are more tolerant. Okay, now let's look at the second columns. When we look at these numbers here, these are now these indicators for segregation. How much segregation is there? Yeah? And when we now compare the numbers for the south and the north, what do we find? Well, they're almost exactly the same. Actually, for 1940, there's a little more segregation in the north than in the south. For 1950, it's then slightly more in the south than in the north. And in the 1960s, again, it's sort of like a little more in the south than in the north. But segregation is still high, both in the north and the south. I remember, in the other figures, actually the north was almost twice as tolerant compared to the south. I don't know, twice as many people were tolerant compared to the people in the south. But segregation figures, they seem to be very similar. So when we put these two things together, well, people in the north of the US are more tolerant, but segregation is still high both in the north and the south. Right? What does this show us? Well, that this is not true. Yeah? That this implication, high tolerance region cities should have a lower segregation than low tolerance region cities. We don't find evidence for that. Actually, there seem to be no, if I would do a statistical test on this kind of numbers, because there could be some random fluctuations and whatnot, if I would do a statistical test, I could reject that. It wouldn't be the case. This implication is not true. So, which is sort of a little puzzling now, yeah? Because now you would think, hang on, why isn't there less segregation in cities where people are more tolerant? That's the puzzle. Yeah? But it is one way of showing that our common sense theory doesn't seem to explain things very well, because the implications are not true. Yeah? We can reject the implications of it. There was one implication that we looked at, so we rejected this thing in here. But we had another implication that we came up with. Yeah, remember, we say, okay, if it is really about people disliking others, it should be that an increase in approval rating over time should also lead to a decrease in residential segregation over time. Let's look at these numbers now. So now we're looking at how these numbers evolve over time. And now what you see is that in both the North and the South, approval to residential segregation increases. People are becoming more tolerant, luckily. Yeah, I don't know. So they're kind of leaving the past behind. Well, in the 1960s, there were still sort of a lot of intolerant people, but numbers increase. Yeah, when you look at the 1940s and you compare it to the 1960s, people become more tolerant. Again, now let's look at how the residential segregation evolves over time. Well, actually, for the South, it even increases over time, from the 1940s to the 1960s. Yeah? For the North, there's not really a pattern. It kind of goes up and then it goes down again. So when we bring these two things together, yeah, I don't know, we see that from the 1940s to the 1960s, people become more tolerant, but at the same time period, segregation increases or remains the same. Well, this doesn't go along with this implication here. So again, we can reject we don't find evidence in favor of this implication, which then tells us that, hang on, maybe the explanation that we had to begin with might be wrong. Yeah. So now I hope to have shown you that kind of this simple, common sense explanation, which is sort of a reasonable one to make. Yeah, but it's also such a dangerous one, because you see a macro level pattern and you would say, okay, at the micro level it must be exactly like that. Now I just showed you it's not like that. It's not like that. Okay, so the big question is, why is there segregation? And why does it not go away when people become more tolerant? Okay, and this is now where the segregation process comes into play. And we'll talk much more about that on Wednesday, but let me nevertheless introduce this segregation process, this idea here. Segregation process. Now I'm using a definition from, two other esteemed colleague of mine, from Rob Mayer and Elizabeth Bruch. They wrote about segregation quite a lot in the American Journal of Sociology and so on. So basically they have a definition here saying segregation is the non-random allocation of people who belong to different groups into social positions and the associated social and physical distance between groups. It's nothing different from what I said earlier, about the separation of individuals in distinct parts of societies. But now they kind of have this distinction. Now they say, okay, whereas the segregation processes are the actions that create and sustain segregation. Segregation is the pattern that we observe, and the segregation process is how this comes about. And maybe this rings a bell now, because this is sort of what we try to do in analytical sociology. We have a macro-level phenomena that we try to explain at the end of the day, and then we think about the segregation process that actually leads to it, and how macro-level phenomena influence individuals, how they behave, and how they change the macro level again. Yeah. And what I'm going to show you on Wednesday is that exactly these kind of processes can lead to segregation even when individuals are tolerant. Yeah. So what are the things, so this is basically, analytical sociology a little bit, but what are the things that kind of are driving change here? So let's think about what are the smallest units that do something here. Well, it is individuals that do something. Yeah? Individuals move maybe from one neighborhood to the other. Individuals move their children from one school to the other, and so on. There are individual actors. And that's sort of where I think it's very important. Sometimes sociologists forget about that. They are all so much about the society and about the social and so on that they forget that there are actually individuals in that society. So whatever happens at the society, there must be an individual that does something. And the individual is the actor of how things of whatever happens. And now what could drive an individual's behavior? Well, it could be that there is an individual preference for own group. Yeah, that's again in line with our common sense theory. Actually, what I'm going to show you on Wednesday is that this needs to be there need to be just a small little preference for the own group, and that this will amplify and lead to huge segregation at the end of the day. There could be economic inequalities among groups, there could be discrimination of estate agents and so on. There's fascinating research on these kind of things. So some colleagues of mine, they write these fake applications to employers. They send hundreds of fake applications to employers. which is very cool research design. And what they do, they kind of change the name in the applications. So it's a pretty similar CV, similar kind of university education, similar kind of degree, similar work experience and whatnot. The only difference between two applications, two fake applications, is that the one might have, let's say, an Irish sounding name, while the other person might have an Arabic sounding name. And then they kind of see how many times does the Irish person get a call back, and how many times does the person with the Arabic sounding name get a call back. And with these kind of studies, actually people detect discrimination in the labor market, but also in the housing market. So hopefully I don't face that with my German accent when I'm kind of applying for apartments. But anyway, so the story is that there are feedback loops playing a role here. And I had one example. Maybe I want to show that to you. Nevertheless, before we let me not rush this. I'm going to talk about that then the next time. So basically, I had a question here for you. Think about what happens when an individual leaves a neighborhood. An individual leaves a neighborhood. How does that affect others? Yeah. How can these feedback loops actually matter here? And I'm not going to have you think about that right now. I'm just going to give you the answer straight away. Because essentially two things happen. When one individual leaves a neighborhood, what happens? Well, the composition of the neighborhood where this person lives changes. If I leave my neighborhood, there's one person less who is a foreigner, I don't know, who might be educated or whatnot, or who has a certain salary and so on, who lives in that neighborhood. So I'm changing the composition of that neighborhood by leaving. At the same time, I'm changing the composition of the neighborhood that I'm entering. Now, if I move in a certain neighborhood that might have been a dodgy area or whatnot, or maybe I'm a dodgy guy, but I might actually increase the level of education in that neighborhood by moving there. So, and then the composition of that neighborhood is different. So then other people who live in that neighborhood, they see suddenly, okay, now there's a change in the neighborhood. So you see how sort of individual behavior, how small little moves of single individuals change in a very small way the composition of the neighborhood where this person lives, but then also the composition in the neighborhood where this person enters to. And then the whole story is, and that's sort of what we're going to do on Wednesday, that this can trigger these cascades. This can trigger a chain reaction. That then by leaving a neighborhood, suddenly in the neighborhood where I used to live, the education level drops, and then other people think, hang on, now this is becoming a dodgy area. Yeah? They would have been fine to live there until then, but now because I left, they reassess their environment, and now suddenly they feel, okay, now I reached my limit, now I'm moving elsewhere. At the same time, the neighborhood where I'm going, maybe some other people think, I don't want to live next to those university people. Yeah? That's kind of not my kind of neighborhood where I want to be. They might be affected by me moving over there, right? And then you can see, actually sometimes this dies off very quickly. But if you just go a little bit further, and that's sort of where these tipping points come into play again, or the thresholds and so on that we talked about, if you just go a little bit further in terms of what people's preferences are, then you have these chain reactions, and then at the end you end up in an almost completely segregated environment. And this is basically where agent-based models come into play, and that's what we're going to do on Wednesday. It's basically nothing else than a simulation to simulate these very simple individual moves and think about how macro level implications of that come about. So basically this reading, keep in mind this is a reading for the exam as well, so it's a required reading, so this is important. If you haven't done it yet over the break, do it until Friday. It's about these residential segregation models that we talk about on Wednesday. Yeah? Okay, see you on Wednesday. Friday.